You pick up a fork without thinking about it. You spear a piece of chicken. You twirl some pasta. It's just metal and tines, an object so ordinary you'd never guess it once terrified an entire continent. For nearly 1,000 years, the Catholic Church treated the fork as an affront to God himself. Priests preached against it. Crowds mocked anyone who used one. And in at least one case, a woman's death was blamed directly on the fact that she ate with one. How did a piece of cutlery become that dangerous? The story starts in Byzantium, not Europe. By the 10th century, wealthy households in Constantinople were already eating with small metal forks, refined implements built for a court that prized elegance above almost everything else. To Byzantine eyes, eating with your fingers was crude. A fork was civilization. Then in 1004, a Byzantine princess brought that civilization west. She traveled to Venice to marry the son of the Doge, and she brought her own personal set of golden forks with her. At Venetian banquets, she refused to eat with her hands, instead cutting her food into small pieces and lifting them to her mouth with 2 prongs of gold. The Venetians were scandalized. Local clergy saw a foreign woman refusing to touch food with the fingers God gave her, and they decided this was not elegance. This was pride. This was a rejection of the natural order itself. One churchman went further than anyone else. The historian Giovanni Rabora, who spent years tracing the fork's arrival in Italy, has documented how a cardinal named Peter Damian wrote a furious condemnation of the princess after she died of a wasting illness only a few years after her wedding. Damian didn't call it bad luck. He called it divine punishment, a direct consequence of her excessive delicacy, of a woman so vain she couldn't bear to touch her own food. Her name barely survives in most histories. Her fork does. For the better part of 5 centuries after that, forks stayed almost entirely out of Western Europe. Not because nobody had invented them, because using one marked you as something suspicious, foreign, unmanly, or worse. Think about what that meant for actual dinner tables. Bread, hands, and a shared knife did the work that a fork does today. Eating well meant eating skillfully with your fingers, not avoiding them. So what finally changed? Italy again, first. By the 16th century, forks had quietly become normal in wealthy Italian households, useful for eating messy new foods like pasta, without staining elaborate sleeves and collars. Fashion in the end did what theology couldn't. Catherine de' Medici is often credited with carrying that Italian habit to France when she married into French royalty in 1533. Though historians caution the story has been simplified over the centuries into something closer to legend than fact, what's certain is that forks slowly worked their way into French court life over the following decades, treated less as tools and more as status objects, tiny signals of Italian sophistication. England resisted longest of all, and when the fork finally did arrive there, it arrived as a punchline. In 1608, an English traveler named Thomas Coryat returned from Italy and wrote enthusiastically about this strange new custom of eating with a small metal instrument. He started using one himself back home in London. His friends thought it was ridiculous. They mocked him mercilessly, and one of them even coined a nickname for him that stuck. Furcifer, from the Latin word for fork-bearer, a word that also happened to mean scoundrel, or gallows rogue. Using a fork wasn't just foreign to Coryat's peers, it was effeminate. It suggested a man too dainty, too fussy, too continental to eat like an Englishman. The food historian B. Wilson, who has traced this exact moment in detail, points out that English resistance to the fork lasted well over a century after Coryat brought his home, and that the object remained rare enough in England that most people, well into the 1700s, were still eating primarily with knives, spoons, and their own hands. Even colonial America inherited that suspicion. Puritans in particular saw forks as a vain, foreign affectation, one more piece of continental European excess to be avoided by God-fearing, plain-living people. For a long stretch of early American history, a fork on your table said something about your loyalties, and not necessarily something good. So why did it eventually win? The sociologist Norbert Elias offered an answer that reaches far beyond the fork itself. Elias argued that Europe underwent a slow, centuries-long shift he called the civilizing process, in which societies placed increasing value on self-control, on distancing the body from its own animal functions, on refinement as a marker of status. Touching greasy meat with bare fingers, once simply normal, gradually became something the upper classes wanted distance from. The fork didn't win because it was more efficient. It won because it let people perform distance from their own food, from mess, from the body itself. It became a tiny daily ritual of restraint, and restraint by the 18th century had become fashionable in a way that vanity alone never was. By the time forks reached ordinary households across Europe and America, nobody remembered the theology. Nobody remembered Peter Damien's sermon, or Coriat's nickname, or the princess who died in Venice 1,000 years ago. The fork had simply become invisible, the way truly successful objects always do. It stopped being a statement and became a habit. Now think about your own hand wrapped around the handle of a fork at your next meal. Nobody in the room will think twice about it. Nobody will call you vain, or foreign, or unmanly, or damned. But for most of the history of Western dining, that small, ordinary motion, lifting food to your mouth on 2 or 3 metal prongs, was one of the most quietly controversial gestures a person could make at a table. You pick up a fork without thinking about it. For almost 1,000 years, that was exactly the problem.